Somewhere around 2 million years ago, one of your ancestors told the first lie in the history of the human species. We don't know what it was about. Maybe it was about a food source they wanted to keep for themselves. Maybe it was about who really broke a tool. Maybe it was about where they'd actually been that afternoon. But whatever it was, that single moment, one early human deliberately saying something false to another, may have done more to shape the human brain than almost any other event in our evolutionary history. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. You are by nature a liar, not occasionally. Not as a character flaw, structurally. Your brain evolved specific machinery to make deception possible, and that machinery is one of the most sophisticated cognitive tools any species on this planet has ever developed. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why lying isn't a corruption of human intelligence. In a very real sense, it may be one of the reasons human intelligence exists at all. Let's start with the animal kingdom, because deception did not begin with humans. If you watch nature documentaries, you've probably seen this. A cuttlefish changes color to mimic a rock. A possum plays dead so convincingly that predators lose interest. A fork-tailed drongo, a small African bird, has learned to imitate the alarm calls of other species, tricking them into fleeing so the drongo can steal their abandoned food. These are all forms of deception, but there's a critical distinction that separates them from what humans do. These animal deceptions are almost entirely fixed. The cuttlefish doesn't decide to camouflage itself based on a calculation about what a specific predator currently believes. It's a hardwired reflex, honed by millions of years of natural selection, triggered automatically by environmental cues. The drongo's mimicry is a genetically programmed behavior, refined generation after generation, not a choice made in the moment based on a model of another bird's mental state. Human lying is different. When you lie to someone, you are running an extraordinarily complex mental simulation. You have to understand what you know. You have to understand what the other person knows, or more precisely, what you believe they know. You have to construct a false version of reality. You have to predict how they will react to that false version, and you have to monitor in real time whether they are believing it or not, adjusting your story on the fly if their expression shifts even slightly. That entire process rests on a single cognitive skill that took evolution an enormously long time to build. Psychologists call it theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have their own separate thoughts, beliefs, and knowledge different from your own. Here's where things get genuinely fascinating, because theory of mind isn't something you're born with fully formed. It develops in stages, and researchers have mapped out almost exactly when it emerges in human children, which gives us a remarkable window into when it likely emerged in our species. In the 1980s, developmental psychologists Heinz Wimmer and Josef Perner designed what became one of the most famous experiments in the history of child psychology, known as the false belief test, or more specifically, the Sally Ann test. In its classic form, a child watches a puppet show. Sally puts a marble in a basket and leaves the room. While she's gone, Anne moves the marble to a box. The child is then asked, when Sally comes back, where will she look for the marble? Children under about 4 years old almost universally get this wrong. They say Sally will look in the box because that's where the marble actually is. They cannot yet separate what they know to be true from what another person believes to be true. Somewhere around age 4, something clicks. Children suddenly understand that Sally holds a false belief, that her mind contains information different from reality and different from the child's own mind. That moment, the birth of theory of mind, is also almost exactly the moment children become capable of deliberate, convincing lying. Before that age, children might say false things, but it's often clumsy, obvious, immediately contradicted by their own behavior. After that age, lying becomes genuinely strategic. The child understands that a lie only works if it successfully installs a false belief inside someone else's head, a head the child now understands is fundamentally separate from their own. So, if theory of mind is the engine that makes sophisticated lying possible, the next question becomes obvious. Why did evolution build that engine in the first place? This is where we have to talk about one of the most influential and, at the time, genuinely controversial ideas in evolutionary psychology, the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. The idea was formally proposed by primatologists Richard Byrne and Andrew Whiten in 1988, though the intuition behind it had been circulating for years before that. Byrne and Whiten had spent years studying primate behavior in the wild, and they noticed something odd. Across multiple primate species, individuals engaged in behavior that looked suspiciously calculated. A subordinate chimpanzee would suppress an excited expression upon finding food, waiting until a dominant chimp had wandered off before eating, clearly managing what information the dominant animal had access to. Baboons were observed feigning distress calls to distract rivals during conflicts over food or mates. Byrne and Whiten's argument was radical for its time. They proposed that primate intelligence, and by extension human intelligence, did not primarily evolve to solve problems like finding food or navigating terrain. It evolved to solve social problems, specifically the problem of living in complex groups where you constantly needed to predict, manipulate, and sometimes deceive other individuals to get ahead. Under this theory, the pressure that built bigger primate brains wasn't really about outsmarting the environment. It was an arms race between individuals within the same species. If deception gave you an edge, being better at detecting deception became critical to survival, which in turn created pressure for even more sophisticated deception to get around better detection, which created pressure for even better detection systems, and so on, generation after generation, in an escalating cognitive spiral. Now here's something that should genuinely surprise you. There's actual statistical evidence connecting brain size to this kind of social complexity. British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, whose name might be familiar if you know about Dunbar's number, the famous limit on stable social relationships humans can maintain, ran a comparative study across dozens of primate species in the 1990s. He found a striking correlation. Species with larger neocortex size relative to overall brain size consistently lived in larger, more complex social groups. And critically, species with more complex social structures also showed more frequent documented instances of what researchers classified as tactical deception, deliberate behavior designed to mislead another individual for the deceiver's benefit. This wasn't a small effect. Byrne and Whiten's later database work, cataloging hundreds of observed instances of deceptive behavior across primate species, found that the frequency of documented deception scaled almost directly with neocortex ratio. The bigger the thinking brain relative to body size, the more sophisticated and frequent the deception observed in that species. Humans, with by far the largest neocortex ratio of any primate, sit at the extreme end of that curve, which raises an uncomfortable but genuinely compelling possibility. Some of the same cognitive machinery that allows you to plan, to imagine future scenarios, to understand other people deeply enough to form genuine relationships, may have been shaped, at least in part, by an ancient evolutionary pressure to be good at fooling each other. But deception alone doesn't explain everything, because if lying were purely about individual advantage, you'd expect it to be a corrosive force, something that tears social groups apart. And yet, human societies, some of the most cooperative, tightly bonded social structures on the planet, run on a constant low hum of small deceptions. This is where the story takes a turn that most people don't expect. Psychologist Bella DePaulo at the University of California, Santa Barbara ran one of the most detailed studies ever conducted on everyday lying in the 1990s. She had participants keep diaries recording every lie they told over the course of a week. The results were staggering. On average, people told roughly 1 to 2 lies per day. But here's the critical detail almost nobody focuses on. The overwhelming majority of these lies were not selfish, exploitative, or malicious. They were what researchers call prosocial lies, small deceptions specifically designed to protect someone else's feelings, smooth over social friction, or maintain group harmony. Telling a friend their haircut looks great when it doesn't. Saying you love a gift you actually dislike. Claiming you're fine when you're clearly not, specifically to avoid burdening someone else with your problems. These are lies. Genuine, deliberate falsehoods. And they are, according to DePaulo's data, the vast majority of what actually comes out of human mouths when we're not being fully truthful. This suggests something that complicates the simple, cynical version of the Machiavellian intelligence theory. Lying didn't just evolve as a weapon for individual advantage against the group. It may have also evolved as social glue, a mechanism specifically for maintaining cohesion within groups that had become too large, too complex, and too interdependent to survive on brutal, unfiltered honesty alone. This connects to something anthropologists have long suspected about the specific pressures that shaped early human cooperation. Unlike most primates, early human groups depended on cooperation that extended well beyond immediate kin. Hunting large game, defending territory, raising children collectively, all of it required maintaining trust and goodwill across a wide network of individuals who were not necessarily blood relatives, and who you might need to rely on again tomorrow and the day after, potentially for the rest of your life. In that kind of environment, brutal, constant honesty could be genuinely destabilizing. Telling someone their hunting technique was clumsy, or that their idea for where to find water was foolish, or that you found their appearance unattractive in a small group you were permanently bound to for survival. These kinds of unfiltered truths could fracture the exact cooperative bonds your life depended on. A capacity for small, carefully calibrated deception, the social lubricant of prosocial lying, may have been just as critical to group survival as the capacity for detecting the dangerous kind of lie, the one that genuinely genuinely threatened your interests. This is a strange and slightly uncomfortable evolutionary picture. It suggests that human societies were never built entirely on honesty. They were built on a delicate, constantly negotiated balance between truth and carefully managed deception, and the species that got that balance right survived better than the species that didn't. There's a darker layer to this story too, one that researchers have only recently begun to fully understand, and it involves what happens inside your brain the more often you lie. In 2016, a team of neuroscientists led by Neil Garrett and Tali Sharot at University College London ran an experiment specifically designed to test whether repeated dishonesty changes the brain's response to lying over time. Participants played a game where they were financially incentivized to give another person misleadingly optimistic information, essentially to lie for personal gain, while their brain activity was monitored in an fMRI scanner. What they found was genuinely unsettling. The first time participants lied, their amygdala, the brain region heavily associated with emotional response, including guilt, fear, and discomfort, showed a strong spike in activity. But as the experiment continued and participants kept lying, that amygdala response steadily, measurably decreased. By the end of the session, participants who had escalated their dishonesty the most showed the sharpest decline in emotional response to their own lies. Garrett and Sharot called this effect emotional adaptation, and their conclusion was direct. Small acts of dishonesty, left unchecked, appeared to desensitize the brain's natural aversion to lying, making larger and more frequent dishonesty progressively easier over time. In other words, your brain doesn't just make lying possible. Under the right conditions, it actively lowers its own resistance to it the more you practice. This finding lines up disturbingly well with something criminologists and behavioral economists had already observed anecdotally for decades, that large-scale fraud and dishonesty rarely begins with one dramatic act. It almost always begins small and escalates gradually. Each act of dishonesty slightly easier than the last because the brain itself has quietly adjusted its baseline. So where does all of this leave us? What does it actually mean that lying is, in a strange and layered way, one of the more sophisticated products of human evolution? It means the capacity for deception is not a bug sitting inside an otherwise honest species. It's structurally built into the same cognitive architecture that gives you empathy, that allows you to understand other people deeply enough to love them, to comfort them, to build genuine trust with them in the first place. Theory of mind is what makes both possible: the ability to model another person's inner world well enough to lie to them convincingly, and the ability to model that same inner world well enough to know exactly what they need to hear when they're struggling. Somewhere around 2 million years ago, that capacity began emerging in your ancestors, driven by the escalating social pressures of living in groups, too complex, too interdependent, and too consequential to survive on either pure honesty or pure deception alone. The species that struck the right balance between the two, honest enough to maintain trust, deceptive enough to smooth over the countless small frictions of constant close social contact, outcompeted the ones that couldn't. You are the descendant of that balance. Every white lie you've ever told, every uncomfortable truth you've ever softened to protect someone you cared about, every small strategic omission you've made to keep a relationship intact, all of it is running on cognitive machinery that took roughly 2 million years to build. The next time you catch yourself telling a small lie, and you almost certainly will sometime today, remember what you're actually doing. You're not failing at honesty. You're performing one of the oldest and most quietly sophisticated behaviors your species has ever evolved. The exact same behavior that, alongside its capacity to divide us, has also, in its own strange way, been holding us together for 2 million years.